Hi, everyone. I'm here to have a chat with my good friend, Paul Bodnar, who's now the global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, which, by the way, is the world's largest asset manager with trillions and trillions under management. He'll tell me exactly what it's up to at the moment because it changes every couple of months. Paul's got an extraordinary job, which is to try and map and match what's going on in climate change and sustainability to the investment models and approaches that BlackRock is using to manage its huge portfolio on behalf of asset owners, investors, pension funds, insurance funds, and so on around the world. Paul, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations to Climate Bonds Initiative for putting on another fantastic event. You guys have really been an engine of progress in this market for a long time, including powering through the pandemic. So thanks.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks for those kind words. I wanted to start off with a sort of bigger picture thing. You know, we've seen a rather extraordinary developments the last 18 months, not just the brutal pandemic and the growing awareness of the links to that pandemic, of biodiversity destruction, of climate change, in fact. And, you know, the World Health Organization is predicting pandemics the last 30 years, and we're now beginning to get to them. But also, bouncing out of that pandemic, the extraordinary commitments by governments. We now have most of the world's large economies committing to 2030 targets, which are very substantial, thanks to the Biden Climate Summit earlier this year. In a sense, people, investors, are now telling me the future is clear. What it looks like is clear. It's a matter of the speed, how quickly we get there. How do you see this, or how do you see the implications for capital in the last 18 months? What's your reading?
Yeah, Sean, as you say, it's been an extraordinary 12, 24 months in the history of climate action, climate policy. And it's also a pretty perilous time as we look forward. So on the one hand, the world has coalesced around something of a consensus about the need to hold warming to 1.5 degrees and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. So there's never been more consensus about that, not just among governments, but also in the corporate sector, in the financial sector. This is a really big difference compared to where we were when we concluded the Paris Agreement 6 years ago, which was, at the time, climate action was understood largely as a job for governments. And Paris ended a multi-decade process of trial and error in which governments were trying to create a framework for action that was all about them. And of course, governments are absolutely necessary, and we will not tackle this problem without relying to a very large extent on government leadership. But what's interesting about the last few years is that drive to engage societal stakeholders in the net zero story has also expanded beyond the governmental realm and is now much more of a pluralistic and inclusive sort of undertaking that includes financial institutions and corporate. So that's good. Although I think if you look at what commitments really mean, Sean, I think you'll see a great variety of where you might place like commitments or aspirational goals versus targets versus real plans versus being on track. Those are very different things, right? So let's just acknowledge that. But
and that's a real challenge, obviously, that we've got so much talk around this idea of 2050 commitments and then 2030 commitments, and some criticism coming through from the NGO sector to the governments because of the reasons you say. Like there's a lot of loose ends underneath that. But at least we have the headline commitment, don't we? But you raise an interesting point, which is it's a lot more than governments. In fact, governments can't do all of this themselves. We need corporations, we need investors, we need all sorts of active cities to be making real change. So where are we? I mean, like, we need a lot. We've spoken a lot about what we need for the last few years. In practice, though, especially if you're looking as an investor where you've got to deploy funds, where do you think we're actually up to in terms of what's happening and the development of opportunities that would make a difference to portfolios to get the returns that we need, as well as addressing climate change?
Well, Sean, from an investor perspective, I find it useful to think in very concrete terms about what net zero means, getting to net zero. We're talking about remaking the physical asset base of the global economy, no less than that, right? Because across every sector that you can think of, where carbon emissions are significant, either in that sector or in its supply chain, whether it's power generation or buildings or shipping or aviation, steel, cement, chemicals, passenger vehicles, you name it. The problem we're facing is that we have physical assets, cars, cement plants, power plants, commercial buildings that provide essential services to the modern economy. And we want them to continue to do so as we expand the modern economic opportunity to more and more people in the world. But we want to scrub the carbon out. And so we need to do a fundamental overhaul of these technologies at a speed which is unprecedented. Because what the science tells us is that in order to be on track to net zero by 2050, much less to hold warming to 1.5 degrees, which is a goal that much of the world has embraced, we need to cut global emissions by half by 2030. And cutting emissions by half by 2030 implies a pace of capital stock turnover that we haven't seen. So it's about a lot more than just, yes, there's an opportunity side. There's investing in the new climate economy, right? Financing projects, companies, technologies, new business models that are designed to deliver the transportation solutions of the future, the heating and cooling solutions of the future, the low carbon agriculture solutions of the future, adaptation solutions. That's the opportunity side. The harder side, Sean, in a sense, is what do we do with all these assets that we've got online right now that the science tells us need to be cycled out of service sooner than their technical and economic lifetimes said they ought to be. So when you did the project finance for a particular asset, or when you bought a company, right, you're now being told, well, actually, we need to shut down all coal in the OECD by 2030. So what do we do with assets that we're planning to be operated longer than 2030? And the list goes on, cascading through different sectors of the economy. So this story, which is accelerated capital stock turnover, has obviously this opportunity dimension, and it has this risk dimension, which includes stranded asset risk. And as you mentioned, the key question is pace. So we know where we're going. The direction of travel is clear. We're headed towards a net zero emissions economy, but we're not indifferent to the speed at which we get there. And in fact, the attainment or non-attainment of these societal goals around net zero is very much a function of speed, and speed is the tough part. You look at the dip in global emissions that happened in 2020 due to COVID, right? That is the pace at which we would need to reduce emissions every year between now and 2030 to make it true that the world is on track to 1.5 degrees. And the world, as you know, right, experienced last year's dip in emissions as a trauma, right? It was the global economy being put in an induced coma, and not exactly something people felt great about and that they cared to repeat every year between now and 2030. So the challenge here is that we're stuck between, on the one hand, investment opportunities we can grasp, but a timetable that's uncertain, right? And so that's the challenge that investors grapple with, which is they see the direction of travel is clear, but they very much need to know whether, for example, the uptake of electric vehicles is going to happen slowly, at medium speed, or fast if they want to invest in a fast charging network.
And there are so many dependencies which could lead to that. For example, the scale and the speed of green hydrogen rollout, if the Biden administration's $1 a tonne by 2030 is met, makes all the difference to what we do in steel and cement and the kind of capex investments you make there. It's tough, hey? So how the hell are you sorting this out?
Well, I think one thing we're thinking about, which I think everybody, including I think your next panel here, is grappling with, is learning to think about the future both as it should be and also as it will be. Right. So we have this year an incredible new tool published by the International Energy Agency in its net zero 2050 scenario. And if you're an investor and you look at that report, you see a lot of investor relevant metrics in it that tell you electrolyzer capacity that will be online in 5-year increments, or the share of new vehicles that are new vehicle sales that are electric in 5-year increments. The problem is those are normative numbers, meaning that's solving for the world as it should be. It's answering the question, can the world get to net zero by 2050? The answer is yes. And here is what it looks like if it does. Mm-hmm. But we also need tools that help us navigate between the scary scenarios of inaction on the one hand, as amplified by the recent IPCC report, and these more hopeful and granular pictures of success on the other hand, as exemplified by the IEA report. The truth lies somewhere in between. And as you know, it's not clear that we're going to be successful in achieving 1.5 if we don't get our act together faster in every realm of the global economy, including policy and investment and technology development, consumer preference, et cetera.
So you mentioned earlier in our conversation, you thought that one of the hopeful signs was the fact that we are now having collaborations at a variety of industry levels, sector levels in a way that we weren't 2 years ago. Tell us a bit more about what you're seeing there. Make us feel hopeful, given what you just said.
Sure. No, I do think we're staring at a major challenge, obviously, because we are trying to collectively, or we are talking about the fact that it would be beneficial for us to undertake the most significant induced transformation of the global economy ever attempted at speed. And until recently, we have been relying on, I would say, the old technologies of international relations and international cooperation in imagining how we would do so. What gives me hope is that I think you're seeing the emergence of entirely new forms of international cooperation in response to the climate challenge. So I mentioned earlier that we've seen net zero commitments made, serious net zero commitments made up and down corporate supply chains and by the financial sector. You have a net zero asset managers initiative that we're part of, a net zero asset owners initiative, a net zero banking alliance, a net zero insurance alliance. So people are at the table and they want to help and they want to figure out what their role is in this story. And in doing so, they're forming new kinds of collaborative efforts that I think hold great promise in driving decarbonization. So if you look at the shipping sector and the way that regulators, shipping, the companies that own ships, right, the banks that finance ships, the customers that move cargo on ships, the shareholders of these companies are coming together in new ways to chart a course, no pun intended, for net zero in that particular sector. And you're seeing this being replicated in other global industries, because after all, the Paris Agreement is very important, as I said. It's an agreement among sovereign governments. And you're not going to decarbonize the global economy just through a stack of 195 parallel NDCs. That's not the way the global economy works. You have global markets, global supply chains, global investor groups, shared technology pathways. So the challenge is that we need to think and act like the economy we are trying to decarbonize, which is one that transcends borders. And that's what you're starting to see in these sectoral platforms, bringing together corporates, their shareholders, their banks, their customers, their suppliers, and their regulators, who together influence outcomes, right? So we're transcending this binary policy and other framework that we've had to create new ways of solving the problem.
Paul, you mentioned this is a vast CapEx job we've got ahead of us. To make the change, to shift the global economy the way you described it, is really likely to be one of the largest, or the largest infusion of capital into the global economies we've ever seen in history. Luckily, we've got the capital floating around, most of it in negative interest rate bonds in Japan and Germany, so we can redeploy. But one of the things that is suggestible, what you're saying, is the global shift of capital. BlackRock has exposures across multiple economies, more than 2 trillion just in Europe. Then you've got Japan, you've even got an exposure to China. So the need to be able to shift to capital and locate investments that are consistent with how you see the world changing is clearly important. That also suggests, does that need to mean more engagement between those economies, more collaboration between the major economies to shift it? Or are we going to find ourselves in places where some places become off limit because they're not making changes? How do you see the geopolitics catching up with the global financial integration that's already well and truly underway?
Well, first of all, for BlackRock, it's about our clients. It's not our money, it's their money. So we are working with our clients to help them understand this landscape and to evaluate how and why they might get more exposure to sustainability and the low carbon future in particular. So that's what we're doing across these jurisdictions. And we have a clear conviction around why that's a smart move, and why the world why our clients on aggregate would benefit from the world successfully managing this transition to net zero. Now, the geopolitics are obviously a huge factor here, and the Paris Agreement, I think, showed both the successful management of a deal, but also the limits of international relations among nation states in driving this solution. So what you're seeing this year in the run-up to the Glasgow COP is an effort to try to get nations to compete with each other almost for ambition. But also you're seeing the rise of conversations about carbon border adjustments, which I think reflect to some extent the seriousness of the issue. I mean, I remember, and you will too, in the days of the Kyoto Protocol, when nations were working on this because they felt that they had to, but you could say they didn't really want to. And they were not necessarily convinced that it was in their self-interest. I think what you're seeing today is that countries are very much seeing climate action as in their self-interest, and they're exploring ways, including trade measures, to protect themselves and their companies as they make a transition that they see as being in their self-interest. So obviously the world is not gone in a tremendously multilateral direction in the last 5 or so years, and relations are not what they once were between the US and China. And so we're working against that, in the face of headwinds, I would say, geopolitically. But to me, the rise of this conversation about trade measures is positive in the sense that it reflects the seriousness, which you've never seen before among governments in moving ahead with climate policy.
Look, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that is one of the big changes of the next couple of years. And I want to end up with a question about how you see this unfolding. But I suppose BlackRock's been very much on the record, and Larry Fink's written his very famous letters to investors about the need for engagement with companies and getting involved in what their future strategies might be. And of course, we've seen some particularly important milestones about engagement in the last couple of years. I guess the question is, can we see greater involvement with sovereigns, with cities, with municipalities in supporting their shift towards addressing these risks going forward, given the extent of sovereign and SSA bond holdings in BlackRock's portfolio? But look, I'm getting out of court here, Paul. That's one of the things you're talking about. I know I'm posting out for the audience. I guess what I'm interested from your perspective is, you've been in this job for only a few short months now. I'm curious to know what you found that's interesting. It's been a learning curve you mentioned earlier. What's been interesting to share with the audience, and then how you see this whole discussion unfolding in the next 12 months or so. Start off with the journey.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is there's very clear evidence of a big shift in financial markets towards sustainable investing. We see it in our own business. A growing share of our assets under management are in the sustainable strategies that we've crafted to help our clients get exposure to these opportunities. So the flows are there, and as you said earlier, the capital is there. I think and we're engaging with a larger and larger number of companies in which we are invested on behalf of our clients to ask them the tough questions of how will you thrive in a net zero world? How will you thrive in the journey to that world? How are you preparing yourself for this change that is already well underway in many sectors of the economy? So it's been striking to see just how much momentum is building, both on the supply side of capital and also on the corporate side. I think, however, the biggest issue that we're going to have to grapple with as a global community in the next 12 to 24 months is frankly the growing disconnect between the trajectory of emissions and the trajectory they need to be on. They are bumping along at a global level, more or less the same level on average for the last 4 or 5 years. You've got the COVID dip, but then the bounce back. And so we need to be clear about the implications of delay, right? If we're serious, as the world governments of the world seem to be, that they're going to want to drive a reduction in emissions to net zero by 2050, the longer they wait to take decisive action to make it so, the greater the risk of economic dislocation that will result, which is exactly what the Inevitable Policy Response Project has been trying to map out. And so that's, I think, both the opportunity and the peril of the next 12 to 24 months is how will we build pace? How will we get our actual rate of change a little bit closer to the now consensus of what that rate of change needs to look like? And how can we do so while also promoting a just transition from one state of the economy to the other, and while minimizing stranding and economic dislocation as much as possible?
It's a big question, a really big question, but we do actually have at least its commitments to work with, which means for investors, we can say pretty reasonable chance they're going to get there. The later they leave it, the more drastic are going to have to be the cuts to the end, which introduces policy risk that we're going to have to figure out how to manage in our portfolio settings. Hey, but Paul, you've got an amazing job. I'm going to say, if there's one thing I can be certain of, is that every single person listening to this conference is going to be saying, go Paul, go Paul. So good luck with the incredibly important work you're doing. Good luck with rethinking how we tackle this problem. And thank you for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Thanks, Sean. And as you say, it's a really fun job, especially to have the opportunity to work with our clients who are thinking deep thoughts about this and trying to navigate this perilous journey, and to work with many of the other folks who are featured in your program. So we're all in this together. We're all trying to manage this problem together. And thank you again for the role that CBI has played for many years in driving us forward.
Thank you.